Welcome to Block 44 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Hawaii block. For this block, you will need 3 fabrics, a light, a medium dark, and a dark. From the dark fabric, cut 8 squares that are 3 inches by 3 inches, 2 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and 2 squares that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. I was able to cut all of the pieces I needed from a single 3-inch strip of fabric. You could also cut each of these squares from different fabrics if you want to have a scrappy sort of block. From the medium dark fabric, you need to cut 8 squares that measure 3 inches by 3 inches, 2 squares that measure 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and 2 squares that measure 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. If you want a block with a scrappy look, you can cut each of these squares from a different fabric. If this is the first Celebrating the States block that you've found, our YouTube channel has a playlist to keep them all together. We'll leave a link in the description below. From the light fabric, cut 4 strips that are 1.5 inches by the width of fabric. From those strips, you'll need to cut the following: 2 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 12.5 inches, 4 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 10.5 inches, 4 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 8.5 inches, 4 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 6.5 inches, 4 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and 2 rectangles that are 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. You will also need 1 square that's 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Start with the light 2.5 inch square and all of the 1.5 inch squares of the medium dark and dark. You can either draw a line on the wrong side of each of the squares from corner to corner, or you can use diagonal seam tape to help guide your seams. Put the medium dark fabrics on opposite sides of the light 2.5 inch square. You'll have right sides together and you'll sew corner to corner. Trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch and press the seam open. I just did a quick finger press. Use the same technique to add the dark 1.5 inch squares to the other opposite corners. Before we move on to the next step, take time to press this with an iron. To help reduce bulk on this part, I press the seams open. Next, we're going to add light rectangles. We're going to start with the 1.5 by 2.5 and then the 1.5 by 4.5. With right sides together, piece using 1/4 inch seam allowances onto opposite sides of the center square. Press towards the rectangle. I just did a finger press for this first seam. To construct this block, we will alternate between adding light rectangles to the sides of the block and then adding triangles to the corners. For some of these seams, I just did this finger pressing, but for most of the longer seams, I did use an iron to press toward the rectangle. This block will be one of our most piecing intensive blocks in the whole series. This block has 55 pieces to it. But don't let that scare you away from doing the block. It turns out beautifully. For this second round of triangles, we're using the 2.5 inch squares. Each corner that you add will sew through and cover the corner of the previous round. If desired, you can sew a 1/2 inch away from the first diagonal line and cut in between the 2 lines to get your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that will give you a spare half square triangle block that you can use in another project. The spare half square triangle block will have a seam in the light area, so it's up to you whether you want to save them or not. Press towards the triangles and then do the opposite corner in the medium dark fabric. Now we have a square and a square and a square block. For the next round of rectangles, you use the 1.5 by 4.5 and 1.5 by 6.5. The rest of the corner squares for the block will be the 3-inch by 3-inch squares. The final results of this block are very pretty, but this block is also repetitive and a little tedious, but it's not hard. It was one of the more time-consuming blocks. I just thought I'd better warn you about that up front. I've cut a good deal of the repetitive sewing out of the video, but hopefully you'll see enough to get the job done. There are 5 rounds of adding rectangles to each side of the center square, and there are 5 rounds of adding triangles to the corners of the square. Once the block gets big enough, you can add all 4 corners onto one time instead of doing opposite corners and then pressing and then doing opposite corners again. This block is called the pineapple block, and some of you may have a ruler that could speed this block up a little bit and do it in a slightly different method. But I use this method to help those who don't have a pineapple ruler. This block would also make an excellent one-block quilt to have the whole thing be this block, and each square could have different lights and different medium darks and darks, and just mix up all your scraps. It would be gorgeous. So just keep sewing. The finished block is worth all the effort. One more round each of rectangles and triangles, and this block will be finished. One last pressing and our Hawaii block is done. This block will measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. We hope you'll give this video a thumbs up to let us know you liked it. Leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!